Welcome to Grappling with the Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Jonas Goldson, and I would like to welcome my guest for today. With me is Mark Brown, who's a world champion speaker, executive coach, and an artificial intelligence software advisor. Laura Gray is a passionate people connector, columnist, author, and development director of the ALS Association Northern Ohio chapter. And Dr. Robin Odgaard, known as the Mental MacGyver. She provides luxury level, high performance support and coaching to executives, founders, celebrities, and athletes. She is also the creator and facilitator of the Quick Hits podcast. Thank you all for being with me today.
Thank you.
Good
Pleasure.
to see you.
And thank you to Mark Brown for proposing this topic.
Oh, I did not
We
know
have him
that.
to blame. Okay.
Well, it is not my own. It was brought forth to me, and I simply became the conduit to pass it on to the good rabbi. I thought he'd find it interesting, and lo and behold, here we sit today.
Well, we'll find out. And what I always say at the end of each episode is, those of you who are listening or watching, if you would like to propose or suggest a topic, please send it in. And if it's compelling, we'll take it up. So here it is. A man posed this question to an ethicist, emphasis on the air quotes. My wife is ill and lives in a nursing home. Is there anything wrong with me taking a mistress? There are any number of variables that might make this question more or less compelling. Would it matter if the wife suffered from dementia or Alzheimer's and no longer knew who her husband was? What if she were brain dead, had no awareness at all? Would it matter if the wife was likely to recover and return home in a matter of weeks or months? What if the wife willingly gave her consent? What if the wife weren't ill at all, but the couple agreed to have an open marriage? Is there anything intrinsically unethical or immoral about taking marriage vows and then agreeing to relax or discard the implicit conditions of those vows? Finally, is there a social cost to redefining marriage in particular and relationships in general? Are there benefits that might offset those costs? The floor is open.
I want to go first. Because
Take
I
By all
have
means.
questions.
it away.
So the first thing I want to know is, what if the husband was ill? Like if the wife is in and the husband is out, is that one thing? And the husband is in, the wife is out, that's a different thing. What if it's a same-sex marriage? So if we said the word spouse, would it change the conversation? The other thing that I wonder about is, are we talking about marriage from a religious standpoint, i.e. what the church thinks or what your specific God thinks of marriage? Are we thinking about it from a legal standpoint, what the government says about marriage? And I can tell you that in most states, marriage vows are not contractually enforceable. So they really don't care. Or are we talking about marriage as a personal agreement between two consenting, not coerced adults who get to decide what that contract looks like? Those are my questions.
Well, I'd say let's not go the religious route,
Okay.
because I think that that's going to be very much doctrinal and specific to particular
Very cut and dry.
systems.
Mhm.
In terms of legality, well, we're never really here to talk about legality, because ethics extends and should extend beyond the law. But I think your point, Dr. Robin, is well taken. What is implicit in the vow? Is there some universal or absolutist concept of a marriage vow? Does it vary from couple to couple, or is it somewhere in between?
Mhm.
Well, Dr. Robin, I certainly appreciate the number of questions that you kind of put out there to add into our 30-minute discussion. And as he was reading it, I'm like, wow, we got 30 minutes, right? I think, you know what I found, it struck me, especially with my role as development director for ALS, which is Lou Gehrig's disease. as you were reading it. I mean, it was very pertinent in my life. Not that I have encountered this situation in my role, because I have not, but I did think about the people we serve. And I also, for me, I guess I didn't mentally break it down as Dr. Robin did with the different facets, which made a lot of sense to me. I think I go right to the heart for myself. I personally, I'm not married, so I'm not bringing my home life into this response, but I went to the heart because to me is, what's a vow? What is a vow? You use the word vow in this, and I guess I kind of built off of that and thought, and again, these are just thoughts, random thoughts in a sense, but then when is wrong ever right? And those were just like and I know that's grappling with the gray. So, but those were like the three things considering the ALS factor for me, but those were the three things that really hit home about, what is a vow? A vow. And I feel like we can dilute things, and accountability and responsibility gets replaced with, I'm sorry, I'll go to rehab and let's get back together. And I'm like, so again, just random thoughts that went through my head.
Well, I will piggyback on your thought, Laura, about the vow. And being a self-confessed word nerd, I consulted my lexicon. And the first definition given to me by Word Hippo was a solemn promise to perform some act or behave in a specified manner. And when you juxtapose solemn and promise, to me, that's heavy. I thought of the word covenant when you mentioned the vow. And I know we don't want to go religious or legalistic. When you mention marriage, it seems to me, certainly in North America in the 21st century, marriage vows are easily nullified, because I hear tell of divorce rates of 50% and upwards. I do not have hard numbers on that. It seems to me, though, that marriage vows are easy to break. But from an ethicist standpoint, which I am not, but to pursue that, okay, we're not sure if the vow covenant means by all means under no circumstances. However, the tenor of the question to me seems that the person taking the vow or entering into a covenant is more concerned about their own personal needs than the condition of the individual to whom they have made this vow and committed to a covenant. So my first thought is, it's kind of selfish to think of yourself when someone you supposedly love is in distress and could be in a very serious condition. My first thought is, ethically, should you not look at the vow first and be less selfish? And of course, Dr. Robin wants to jump all over that, so I will now yield the floor to her.
I just have another question, because vows are not written in stone. In fact, in Washington, D.C., you can officiate your own marriage ceremony and you don't have to say anything. You can turn around in a circle and say, now we're married. And now you've told the government we're having a relationship. So are we splitting hairs by saying, well, what vows did you make in your marriage ceremony? Or are we talking about the spirit of marriage? And in that case, I go back to two consenting adults and what they've agreed to.
I would agree.
Go ahead.
Well, I would agree with, no offense, but I'm agreeing with the last statement, because if I think about Washington, I don't view them as a moral high ground at all. Not that they're potentially anywhere in the US that is at this point. But I feel that for me, I also think, and this is a little legal, but that the government has no business in who I decide to enter into a covenant or vow with. So, I mean, again, there's so many offshoots to this, but I feel that it is personal. The one thing that, Jonathan, when you added and then what if it's an open marriage? And I thought, well, shoot, then there goes my whole vow concept. They might have written that into their vows.
And I very much had that in mind when I phrased that question. Some of us may remember when the term no fault divorce was introduced.
Oh yeah.
And I find that disturbing and dangerous. Because the whole concept of a vow, I think you framed it very nicely, Mark, as a covenant. What is a covenant? It is it is carved in stone in at least a figurative sense.
Enduring commitment, yes.
That there is an absolute commitment here. There's another term that has become somewhat more popular, which also baffles me, which is amicable divorce. I mean, you should get divorced because you despise each other. If you're amicable, why are you getting divorced?
I love you. Goodbye.
Because it's not working.
I really can't wrap my head around. But there is that idea of a covenantal contract, and that.
But so we're talking about a mistress, right? So we're assuming that means emotional and physical. We're going to use the infidelity as a word. But if that person said, like, I asked my husband this question, and he and I have a really, really good relationship. I've been married to him for 10 years. We are phenomenal partners. And he said to me, Robin, if I don't know who you are, I love you enough to say, go be happy. You don't need my signature to do that.
While you were married.
Yeah. If I was still married to him, if he ended up brain dead or, whatever.
Oh, I thought you meant like tomorrow.
Well, and that's true too. Like our relationship is like that. If he decided tomorrow that, Robin, you don't make me happy, I'd be like, well, that's going to be a mess to undo, but okay.
Okay, but you would
I
say
don't get the
Mary,
okay
if he
part.
decided to enter into a relationship and you were like, okay, but we'll stay married. And
Well,
that's it.
No, well, if we had a conversation, so that's the thing
Prior.
for me, it's all about consenting.
Okay.
If I go to him and say, hey, I want to do XYZ thing, and he goes, yeah, I'm okay with that. I don't care what the rest of the world thinks. It's between he and I. So I feel like if a couple has had a conversation prior to a person going into becoming ill and not being
Right.
they can do whatever they want, married or otherwise.
That's the part we don't know unless Mark Jonasson did add on if that was written. Of course, in my mind, I'm like, when did they sign it? Was it in permanent ink?
Does it have to be signed?
Were they lucid?
No, he talked about that. If they had signed consent, whatever he said.
Right.
Well, I think
Yeah.
whatever we're sort of shifting back and forth between the legal and the ethical. But if a vow is something that is meant to be firm and enduring,
But that depends upon what the vow was then. What words
that's
did
true.
you say?
and that's why I'm saying there. I think there was a time when there was much more implicit in the institution of marriage,
Yes.
that there was this. It was a contract. It was covenantal, and so if at some point later we both say we agree not to honor the vow we made to each other, is there a, I mean, I won't even, I think there's a fallout.
Okay, tell me more, because I disagree. So tell me more. What fallout and why?
It was, we made a commitment, we made a vow, we made a word, we gave our word to each other, and now we're agreeing mutually that we don't have to keep our word.
We're changing our mind by mutual consent.
But
We're growing.
no, but so we're nullifying the vow. So was it really a vow? So I make a promise, and then I decide that I don't want to or need to keep the promise. Then was it ever really a promise? Was there anything implicit in the promise that gave me an escape clause? Or did I simply invent that myself? And now I have retroactively brought into question my own integrity.
And is a vow different than saying, hey, I'll do something, and then realizing, wait a minute, this doesn't work. Let me go back to that person and have a conversation so we can change it. Is the fact that we're putting the word vow on it what makes it so heavy and unchangeable?
I think there are gradations, and my father always lectured me when I used the word promise casually. He said, only make promises over things that are worthy of promising. And I think that there's something to that.
It sounds, Rabbi, almost as if we are willing to hold ourselves to a standard when we make certain commitments, a covenant or a vow, suggests that we're going to hold ourselves to this commitment and do everything that we can to maintain that until we leave this planet in whatever way we see that happening. I understand what Dr. Robin is saying. Can't we just change our minds at some point? You know what? We've gone through this for 27 years. It's not what we thought it would be. We're changing. We're growing, to use her word. So can we agree to move on? I believe humans can do that, but I understand your point to some degree. Do we ever hold ourselves to a standard that says, I will not move on this once I make the commitment, however difficult it becomes, I will navigate it in the best way possible. I'll do everything in my power to maintain that promise until there's absolutely no way I can keep it. That's a
I will
thought.
be miserable because I said I would.
Be miserable? Could be. I don't know. There are those, I'm sure we all know individuals who stick with a relationship, be it for the kids, because I am committed to making this work no matter what. I'm sure we all know people who have said that.
Mm-hmm.
And some it works out well, and some it does not. But ethically, do we say it might not work, so let me not make that statement, or I'll say it casually, which of course is an extreme, I think Rabbi was suggesting. And I don't know where that line is. I know personally, if I make a covenant, I'll do everything I can to maintain that covenant and stick with it. But not everyone thinks that that's an appropriate thing for us to do.
Well, and then you have the question of, if the other person breaks the covenant, does that give you an out?
Good question. And you know what? For some people, it does, but they don't take it. They would rather, they want to forgive and try to fix it. How could I make it better? And people are in different life stages, different mindsets. And unfortunately, and I'm sure I will not like this, but I believe the idea of the ethic may vary in the minds and hearts of individuals based upon upbringing, culture, background, and the particular society in which they find themselves.
I think that's definitely true. Right. To answer your question or address your question, Dr. Robin, I think that's the difference between a contract and a covenant. A contract, and this is a point that was made by the late Rabbi Lloyd Jonathan Sachs. He said that you're talking about society and the social contract. He said that he believes one of the reasons why society is falling apart is because a contract is something that if one party breaks, then the other party becomes exempt. And that there's this perception on both sides that the other side has broken the contract and therefore they're not bound anymore. Whereas a covenant is something that's irrevocable. And that if we are bound by a covenant, then it holds us accountable to work harder to make it work, even when we may have reason to try to annul it or to want to get out of it. Clearly,
that sounds like
marriage,
ideal place for abuse to take place.
well, yeah, and that's.
I say that out of personal experience.
Sorry to hear that, Dr. Robin.
If you put someone, not just me, I have friends and colleagues, but if you put someone in a position where they are absolutely bound to a vow and a covenant, regardless of what the other person does, it is terribly abusive.
Yeah, and that's why even, the Catholic Church has had some maneuvering about this issue, but other major religions, there is a mechanism for divorce. There is a mechanism to annul or uproot or undo or end the marriage, because sometimes it needs to be ended. We're talking about something a little more nuanced. We're talking about changing the terms of the marriage because of circumstances. Laura, you have anything you'd like to
I
add in?
think this is taking it back just a few moments when Dr. Robin mentioned about, being miserable, and if you're staying in there and you're miserable, and it just got me to thinking about, giving my power to somebody else then. I mean, I would hope that I'm making a vow with somebody that I am not looking to for my joy. or my self-love, or my 100% source of happiness. I think that's where our ownership and responsibility comes into, not only to the vow we are entering into, but also to ourself, which should be, in some cases, our first commitment to ourselves.
May I add a complication, Rabbi and friends?
Of course.
Even if one decides to maintain the covenant, and I know marriage vows, certainly North America, are written by the individuals. They say what they want, and it's fine. I think it's wonderful. Some people have what we call traditional marriage vows, and one of the lines from those vows are something like, forsaking all others, cleave only unto you until death do us part.
Don't
Thank
forget
you,
the woman's
Shakespeare.
line. The woman's line is to love, honor, and obey.
That notwithstanding, I want to focus on forsaking all others, cleave only unto you until death do us part. And to go back to the scenario of being incapacitated, perhaps someone is terminal, or they are quote unquote brain dead. Has not death parted us in that scenario, technically? And where's the ethical line and the medical line? Do they merge? Do they diverge? Do they meld? Is that also a gray area? Till death do us part. They've been on the machine for 7 months.
Mm.
Is that
Yeah.
not death parting us?
Mm.
And they're in no place to consent or not consent because they aren't functioning.
Right.
Where is the problem there?
Mhm.
Wow.
Well, then you get into the definition of death.
Exactly.
And while for the person in that situation, it would be easier, convenient, or expedient to say that, well, my spouse is effectively dead, and therefore I am effectively exempt from my commitment. But that's projecting onto the situation a particular point of view that may or may not be authentic.
You could see where one could argue that, particularly, and again, not meaning to be rash, but if someone is comatose and has been for a long time, what does that? It's been years. Does that then say, well, no, they're still yours until?
Yeah.
It's a tricky, is it not? Thorny.
Yeah, that's interesting, because the scenario that you just laid out, whether they're brain dead or on a ventilator for whatever, it's like, well, then that's a different level. If they have slight Alzheimer's or whatever, but they're still somewhat functioning, well, then that's a different. So it's like you can have levels of grace in this situation, which I'm not saying is right or wrong, but if you're like, oh, the ventilator for so many months, then I'd be like, yeah, it's probably okay if they had a mistress, which that word is just a Manhattan on a Wednesday night somewhere, because it's so classically dark. It cracks me up when you threw that out there, but yeah.
Mhm.
Still no answers.
Well,
For me, it's very clear. Have this
Well,
conversation up front, know where your spouse stands, have an agreement, and know going in. Don't wait until you're in the situation to figure it out.
well,
You know,
I
there
think
are
that-
couples who don't have that forethought or foresight until it happens.
I said I wasn't going to bring religion in, and I think that certainly to answer the question for our purposes, religion is not the place to look. However, I think there is an understanding that was once more universal. And when it says for better or for worse, that's exactly what it's talking about. The unexpected. It's talking about the unanticipated.
And that was written long before the medical industry could keep you alive for months and months and months. And like death was much more imminent.
That's
Yeah,
true.
you know what? And I agree with that too, because who who gives somebody else the right to put the words in my mouth when I'm making a commitment to another person? I'm just putting that out there again. So we can dial it back to the traditional vows, which I get. But at the same time, if you fast forward to today, when you said now we have the medical technology to keep you alive. Yeah, but I also don't want to read somebody's words from 300 years ago, which may not be pertinent to the relationship I'm entering into.
And to my knowledge,
as a
most people
consensual.
don't. Yeah, people, to my knowledge, nowadays, people write their own vows.
Right,
Mhm.
right.
You know, I have been an officiant, and the couple wrote their own vows. Second couple, they wanted the old vows, and that was their choice. I
Right,
said,
but they're still vows. Interesting,
Yes,
though.
that's
You
true.
called both of them vows, so that's interesting,
well,
though.
yes, they said we'll write our own vows, and
Right.
that was fine. But I want to throw another wrinkle into it, which is the idea, and I know it. Well, I love doing this. The idea of what is the societal view and the impact of what we consider to be ethical within a society that is now so diverse in their thinking, almost divergent in their thinking. What is the ethical line, or is there even an ethical line under these circumstances in 21st century, limited to North American society?
But is it ethics or morals?
Or judgment.
Mm-hmm.
More nouns to add to that: ethics, morals, judgment.
Well,
Am I
certainly
smiling?
the distinction between ethics and morals is a broader topic than we're going to take on right now. I think it's one worth having. Although etymologically, they both come from the same original word. One comes through the Greek, one comes through the Latin,
Oh,
but
I
they
did not know
both have the same origin. So in terms of etymology, there is no distinction. In terms of modern usage, I think we could offer some. But I think that what you're suggesting, Mark, is, you know, when people say they want to write their own vows, that may be what they're saying. Is that actually what they mean? Do they mean a vow?
Mm.
Or are they, you know, are they using the terminology loosely? You know, why is it that divorce has been on the rise steadily? In the last 2 generations, I suppose, whereas it used to be quite rare and uncommon. Is it because we have focused more on what we want than what we're willing to commit?
I raised that earlier. I did say it seemed to have a selfish perspective, but to complicate it even more, Rabbi, I would suppose you are most equipped to answer this question, but you've been on this planet for a few years. You're experienced. In terms of what you see, or how you see society viewing ethics, has the needle on what is ethical appeared to shift in the last 50 years?
Oh, I think there's no question.
Okay.
Um,
Again, I grew up in Jamaica, and whenever I say this, people look at me and they say, "Really?" I'm not as young as I'd like to be. I'm in my 60s now, but I can remember the first time I met someone who was divorced. I was 16 years old. That doesn't resonate in 2023 to anybody I know in America. Wait, you didn't know anybody who was divorced your whole life until you were 16? Yes, because the culture in which I grew up, that was a level of commitment to vows and covenants in which I grew up. But times change and needles shift. So I'm not even clear on what is considered the most ethical stance at this point in time. That's a great area for me personally.
There's another aspect to divorce too, though, is that women now have more freedom than they used to. Women used to have to stay in marriages because they couldn't support themselves and their children otherwise. And women don't have that burden anymore. And so that makes a difference in not staying in an abusive relationship.
Yeah, and also, Mark, it's interesting you say that, because when I was in college, granted this was in California, but I assumed that my friends' parents were divorced until I found out otherwise.
Oh, wow.
Really? You went the other way? Oh,
It was that common. Charlotte says in the comments that divorce rates have fallen in more recently, I think they've fallen relatively little. And I think part of the explanation why they've fallen is because fewer people are getting married in the first place.
Exactly. I was
Yeah.
gonna say that fewer people are
And you know, there's
telling
a
the
term that I
government
just
about their
heard.
relationships.
Yeah, there's a term I just heard recently. Really bothers me. It's called lying flatism.
Lying flatism.
Yes, it's describing many of the young people today who want essentially effortless lives. They don't want to have to work too hard in their jobs. They don't want to have to work hard for relationships. They don't want a lot of stuff. They don't necessarily need a lot of money. They basically just want to be comfortable, not to have to exert themselves. And marriage is hard work. Good marriage is hard work.
I have a phenomenal marriage and this one's not hard.
Well,
I've been
you
in
know,
two that were terrible, that were
well,
terribly hard.
also, as
This
we
one's
get
not.
older, I think we start to figure things out. My wife and I had our 35th anniversary this year, and you know, I'm starting to get the hang of to be a good husband. But
Yeah, I
it
know the
was-
feeling, my friend.
yeah, I mean, it was hard work, and you know, there were times that it would have felt a whole lot easier to walk away from it. But there was this sense of commitment that we committed ourselves to making this work, not just for the children, but because we invested in each other. And while I can't honestly say I've never looked at another woman, I've certainly never seriously contemplated or even whimsically contemplated cheating on my wife or going around or asking her for an open marriage. Those just are not really on my radar. And I'm grateful that we have a relationship that we have made successful, even when it was very, very difficult. Because at this point in our lives, I think it sustains us, even though it can be difficult at this point in our lives too. But when we are too casual or too eager or too willing or too accepting of alternative conditions or diluting the concept of a vow, I think that has an effect on society that contributes to a lot of the unwillingness to commit that we see.
But I'm
No.
sure there are those who think, one quick thought, forgive me, Doctor.
Go ahead, Mark, please.
But I think there are those, you mentioned earlier, open marriage. And I genuinely believe there are those who say, we commit to an open marriage. So the vow is to have an open marriage. Does that nullify the vow? Is that not a vow? If they both agree to it, back to one of the first points Dr. Robin made. If they consent to it, we will have an open marriage. Cool, let's do it.
That's what
so.
polyamory is.
Well, it is, but are you redefining marriage by doing that?
Well, and that goes back to the question, is marriage a religious construct or a legal construct?
Good questions all. Good questions all.
For me, the last thought I had, or one of the final thoughts, was when you were talking about, does it dilute the vow itself and how it has a trickle effect? Well, it does trickle to the children, because then they look at, well, I don't like that job, I don't like that boss, and which actually goes into the lay flatism that you were saying. They're just like, I just want to be, because maybe they've just witnessed some things more so than anyone maybe in our generations did. I don't know.
Yeah, I think about my father, who grew up in the Depression, and he saw his father at dinner time, at supper time, 7 days a week. His father was gone to work when he got up in the morning, when my father got up in the morning, and he came home for supper, and they had supper, and my father went to sleep. And that was his relation with his father for years. And because that was the reality of the time.
Mhm.
And my father was part of what they now call or have called the greatest generation. He was in World War II, didn't see action, but he was, he could have, went to college on the GI Bill, built his own business, and his whole life was about providing security for his family. That was what drove him. That was what defined him. And he could never understand me because I grew up in the 70s and it was the me generation. And it was finding meaning and seeking fulfillment. And that was so foreign to his way of thinking
Mm.
that he just saw me as making one bad decision after another.
What
Until
do we
finally-
think of young people now?
Well, yeah, I mean, eventually I got a job and I was, successful on his terms, and then that's when our relationship got a lot healthier. But it's, that there are definitely cultural changes that happen that that have an effect on society at large. And there's freedom and order, or the way some phrase it, chaos and order, are always grappling with each other. Freedom is chaos, and order can be tyrannical.
Mhm.
And if you have too much of one or too much of the other, then you have a dysfunctional society. But there's always that tension between them.
Mm.
If I may, I know time is fast fleeting, but Laura mentioned the children and the impact on children. We didn't make any assumptions on the ages of the couples involved. But if the couples are in their 40s or their 30s, and one partner is severely ill and could, literally be gone, and months go by and one partner chooses to enter into a new relationship, and the kids are young, they don't fully understand the depth of what's really happening. Should the partner who is healthy maybe delay their action in consideration of the children? Is that the ethical thing to do under that particular circumstance?
I don't know if there's a yes or no answer to a question like that.
Just a question. And Dr. Robert is not saying anything. I'm surprised. I thought I would tee you up with that question. But
Did you see
didn't
my
say-
mouth? I went,
Yeah, you're like, but no, please, we must discuss this. At least I'd love to get your perspective on it.
I feel like children are taught if they're allowed to be happy by whether or not their parents allow themselves to be happy. And so if you do things that make you unhappy in front of your children, they will learn to not allow themselves to be happy. Does that mean I think you should go out and hedonism galore? No, I don't. I don't think that's healthy for children either. But I do think that parents forget that children learn more from what you do than what you say.
But wouldn't you agree then, Dr. Robin, that you mentioned earlier, the couple should have these conversations?
Mhm.
There has to be some conversations with the young people to
There
give them
has
an
to be
understanding
conversations
what's
with the
happening.
children.
And that could
Yes.
vary. What they understand could vary depending upon their age.
Needs to be
And there are
appropriate for
times
age.
parents
Yes.
delay action because the kids are young, and they delay so they can understand and better handle it and not traumatize their kids. Again, complications, more spokes in the wheel, but
I mean, I think if you have a situation where parents are literally at each other's throats, that clearly that's not going to be healthy for the children.
Mhm.
And likely it would be better to dissolve the marriage. If you
I
have a
know
situation-
many adults who wish their parents had gotten divorced sooner
Yeah,
because the
yeah,
house was
absolutely.
so tumultuous.
yeah. But in a case, Robert, we're in a case where, again, they're 37-year-old couple, and one of the two gets deathly ill. And they're in that, the spouse who is doing well, they're in their life is prime. Their libido is alive.
Mhm.
Their spouse is close to not, they can't communicate, on a ventilator, maybe comatose, and they've got these kids at home, and they realize all they're told, there's not much hope. They want to move on, and they find comfort somewhere else in the midst of all this grief. Do they, for the kids who are young, wait until something before they try to find comfort? Do they hide that relationship?
I think
Because
it
they're
depends
suffering
upon the
also?
person.
it's that's also thorny, is it not?
Complicated.
Well, sure. And
Mhm.
the children will interpret, if the children find out, they will interpret it as
Yep.
they choose to.
Yes. Mhm.
And all the explanations and justification and rationalization in the world may not be enough for the children
Mhm.
at that point.
And I mean, I know there are some people, even after the spouse is legally dead, gone, funeral, whole thing, still have a hard time when the left behind spouse moves on.
Mhm.
Mm.
Yeah, my husband tells a story about his father who absolutely refused to speak to his sister-in-law because after his brother died and she was then single, she started seeing someone else, and he said that that was in contrast to her wedding vows, that it was her death that ended the relationship, not her husband's. So she
Really?
wasn't allowed to move on. Yeah.
I had not heard that before.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's
and
interesting.
that's something that I think is going to be much less mainstream.
Mm.
Agreed. Yeah.
And that there is a point at which we say other people may not agree with our decisions, but they are our decisions,
Absolutely.
which is a whole other area of gray that we may go into at some point in the future. But, for now, often we don't get to clear answers, but airing the questions and thoughtfully exchanging our different perspectives is, I believe, part of the way of getting closer to wisdom. So I thank all of you for your participation. Mark Brown for also coming up with a scenario.
You.
Laura Gray, Dr. Robin, always a pleasure. Look forward to the next time we can get together in this or a different constellation of guests. Again, for those of you who are watching or listening, if you have a topic, a subject, a scenario, or a dilemma you'd like us to take up, please go to jonathangoldson.com, use the contact information, submit it. If it's compelling, we will take it up. And until next time, I encourage you to continue grappling with the gray.